Hello and welcome to the Explorer Lab, your ad-free demonetized channel at the frontier of knowledge. We are welcoming today Thomas Whitmore. Thomas Whitmore has been actively involved in the UFO field since 1990 and has served on the Muffin Business Board since 1994. He's a retired financial analyst and assists the business board with strategic planning, administrative and long-term issues. Tom takes a particular interest in the relationship between UFOs and the national security state. He's currently undertaking a research project on the story of the MJ12 affair. You can find his research at tomwhitmoreblog.wordpress.com. Hello, Thomas, and welcome.
Hello, Baptiste. Thank you for having me on.
It's a great pleasure of mine, to be honest. I wanted to have you here because you are currently doing the hardest part of this job, digging through hundreds of official papers in governmental libraries. And it is an ungrateful, hard work. So first of all, thank you for doing it.
Well, thank you. I actually enjoy it. So
That's great.
What some people might think is boring, tedious work, I enjoy immensely.
Ah, great. That's good to hear. I like to dig archives too, but it's a rare pleasure to do. You've been investigating this field for decades. As of now, what is for you the main blocker in your own research you would like to be able to magically remove?
I'm more, at this point in time, I'm a little bit more of a researcher than I am an investigator.
Mm-hmm.
In research, you go into archives, you go through books, you look at footnotes, you look at references, you track and correlate information based on that. But as an investigator, you might track down people, you might figure out where to find somebody, you learn how to develop rapport with witnesses. And then interview a number of witnesses, and you're basically tracking down information that's hard to find.
Mm-hmm.
There are various techniques that private investigators use. I'm not a private investigator, not at this point anyway. So the main distinction is that, like I said, I feel like I'm more of a scholarly type researcher than an investigator type. Now, as for blocks, some people don't want to cooperate and talk to me, and I take part of the responsibility for that, because maybe I was a little too forward, I was a little too direct, and I didn't take the time to try to develop rapport with a couple of people. But the other problem is there's an element of bigotry on the other side. For example, if you haven't served in the military or in the government, they don't. A person might not think you're worthy of being told information that you're seeking. Also, there's an element of arrogance. If someone has been involved in something on a deep level and they just see you as, one of these UFO nuts, that is just looking for a superficial high from getting a little bit of information. So, there's a challenge in getting, really certain key people to cooperate in my own inquiries. But at the same time, I've made contacts as well that are helping, with my studies and my research. So I look forward to digging deeper all the time.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's very interesting. I agree. It's but I understand why they are very reserved, because it's a field with so much stigma that when you have your own reputation, you don't want to risk it at all. So it's a real problem. And hopefully it will be removed in a few years' time when serious reporting allows the stigma to be lifted. So even in France, the MJ12 documents are very famous. But most people don't know what they are, which is very funny, because most of the UFO field in France heard about it, but pretty much no one can define it precisely because they can't read English, or it's just hearsay by documentaries. Can you define very precisely the limitation of the MJ12 documents and the era when they appeared?
Yes, of course. MJ12 is shorthand for Majestic 12. And what happened was during the 1980s, a UFO researcher by the name of Bill Moore and his partner, Jamie Chandray, received a set of documents anonymously. And these documents had actually been photographed on a 35 millimeter roll of film. And they developed that film, and two documents turned up. The longer document is known as the Eisenhower briefing document. And the second one is known as the Truman-Forrestal memo. During that period of time, Bill Moore and Jamie Chandray went to the National Archives in the United States in Suitland, Maryland, and they turned up a third document that mentioned MJ12. That is known as the Cutler-Twining memo. Now, what's on these documents is that the documents are based on this Roswell story, that a UFO was recovered in 1947 in New Mexico. There were alien bodies involved, and this material was recovered, and a super secret committee was formed. And the Truman-Forrestal memo is allegedly an authorization by President Truman at the time in 1947, authorizing the Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, to go ahead and form this committee that was referred to as Majestic 12, the Majestic 12. The other paper is known as the Eisenhower briefing document, and it describes the recovery of the UFO. It also mentions another recovery at a place called El Indio Guerrero in Mexico, just on the other side of the U.S.-Mexico border. But it describes how this recovery had taken place, and that 12 people had been formed into a committee, which is known as Majestic 12. And these 12 individuals are top military, four-star general types, top scientists and engineers like Vannevar Bush, who ran the research and development efforts in World War II, and then other scientists, a couple of government people. So these 12 individuals allegedly were formed to study the Roswell crash and to follow up on this recovery of UFO material, and supposedly maybe even to help manage the UFO problem in general, with the U.S. public. Now, the problem is those documents were received anonymously, and they're photographs of documents. Okay, so their forensic document examiners will tell you that you can't authenticate a document that's not an original. So we have these papers, and when they first came out, a lot of people felt like, these might be authentic. In fact, Bill Moore, who was really leading the charge along with Stanton Friedman in trying to vet these documents, I think at first he felt that, they might be authentic. And Stanton Friedman, well-known, prominent UFO researcher in the U.S., was digging into the individuals on the list. And Stanton Friedman became a real proponent of the authenticity of the MJ12 committee and the MJ12 papers. But at the same time, after this information came out, then people started looking at the documents closely and scrutinizing them, looking at the content and the format and the style and all those things that go into the makeup of the document. And they basically found so many things wrong with it that the general consensus, I'm being repetitive, but the consensus, I think you can fairly state that people that are objective about this feel that this original set of documents are almost certainly not authentic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we have this meme, this idea of MJ12, which has become something of a legend in the UFO world, while at the same time we're dealing with documents that most likely are not authentic.
Mm-hmm. So we have the luck of having in France Pierre Lagrange, who is PhD in sociology that dug a lot of information about Roswell and how it was rediscovered in 1780 with two books. And I think that to understand the topic of MJ12, it is important to come back to Bill Moore and Stanton Friedman. Bill Moore has been quite a controversial figure in the field. Can you, in a few words, describe him, his personality? Have you met him, maybe?
Bill Moore was, I believe he started out as a high school teacher. He knew Russian, and in the late 70s, he wanted to become a professional writer, and he co-authored 2 books with a co-author by the name of Charles Berlitz, and the first book was known as the Philadelphia Experiment, and then the second book was the Roswell Incident. It's a little book that really kicked off the whole Roswell story, the whole Roswell controversy, because it had been described as being a weather balloon back in 1947, and it was pretty much forgotten about. And there was a point in time when Stan Friedman talked with Jesse Marcel, and Jesse Marcel said that he felt like it was extraterrestrial. And then Stan Friedman and Bill Moore and some other people, I'm sure, really started digging into it. And the result was this Roswell Incident book. Well, at the time that was published, Bill Moore was allegedly recruited, probably by Richard Doty from AFosi, to do certain things in conjunction with AFosi. There was something going on with an individual that lived next to Kirtland Air Force Base by the name of Paul Benowitz. That was going on, and I think that AFosi possibly wanted to know what was going on with some of the other people in the UFO field. So Bill Moore was really doing an extensive amount of research and investigation on a whole wide variety of topics. And at the time, yes, he was very controversial, but he's actually a brilliant guy. He's very, very intelligent, and he was getting a lot of information that I think was really helpful in the UFO field. So a little bit later, around 1984, he and his associate Jamie Chandray received these MJ12 documents, and they basically sat on them for 2 years. I think because they were probably trying to vet the documents and trying to learn more about them, and did MJ12 ever actually exist and all this. And come around, I think 1986 or 1987, another UFO author by the name of Timothy Good was coming out with his book called Above Top Secret, which is a real blockbuster of a book at the time. And that was going to contain the MJ12 documents in there. So since Timothy Good was coming out with the MJ12 documents, then Bill Moore did as well. So this launched the whole MJ12 controversy.
So for the sake of clarity, the AFosi, I will give a proper definition. By federal statute, the Air Force Office of Special Investigation provides independent criminal investigative, counterintelligence, and protective service operations worldwide and outside of the traditional military chain of command. Proactively, OSI identifies, investigates, and neutralizes serious criminal, terrorist, and espionage threats to personnel and resources of the Air Force, Space Force, and the US Department of Defense, thereby protecting the national security of the United States. So it's quite a serious department of the Department of Defense. What was the credibility of Bill Moore about the fact that he was recruited by the AFosi?
Well, as the story goes, he got a phone call, and the hook line was, "We think you're the only person that knows what he's talking about." And I think that intrigued him, and meetings were set up, and he met, I think almost certainly with Richard Doty, but Bill Moore claims that he had person that he worked with who was very secretive by the code name Falcon.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know. Well, Richard Doty at the time was with AFOSI during the 1980s. He was with AFOSI until 1986, and he left the Air Force in 1988.
Mm-hmm.
And they were working on a problem that they had with a person by the name of Paul Benowitz. So Richard Doty, since he left the Air Force and after he says that his non-disclosure agreement expired after 20 years, Richard Doty has been giving a number of interviews on the internet, just like we're doing here.
Mm-hmm.
And he claims that Bill Moore had something to do with helping the government bring a Russian scientist to the United States. And Bill Moore allegedly knew some Russian. And in the book Project Beta by Greg Bishop, and that Bill Moore was receiving postcards from the Soviet Union, that he had UFO contacts in the Soviet Union. So that may have had something to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
And according to the story that Moore tells, he was promised information, so-called inside information from the government about UFOs, but he was warned that it would be truth mixed with falsehood, and that he would have to parse, whatever was true in the documents he was receiving with incorrect information. So this launched this whole idea of disinformation in the UFO community. Disinformation as a word never came up in the UFO community until the 1980s. And it also became something of an issue just in general intelligence work, even in the public, because at the time the Soviet Union had a huge disinformation program they called active measures, and that was spread out worldwide, really. But the United States being the main enemy, we received a lot of disinformation from the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So the other side of the coin is Stanton Friedman, who was a nuclear physicist. What is your opinion about his proofs?
Stanton Friedman was a terrific researcher, and he went to the National Archives, he went to the Library of Congress, he went to presidential archives, and really dug into this, especially with especially about the people that are named on the MJ-12 document, the 12 people that are named. And he looked into their backgrounds, and he became convinced that MJ-12 was real. In fact, I brag a little bit because I go to the MUFON symposiums every year since I'm on the board. And when Stanton Friedman was alive, I had been researching the whole MJ-12 issue, and I actually sat down with him a couple of times and sat eyeball to eyeball with him and asked him some very direct questions, about concerns that I had. But he would just shrug his shoulders because he was convinced that MJ-12 was real. Now, a lot of other information had been pulled by the Woods, Robert Wood and his son Ryan Wood, and they're authors of the MJ-12 website, majesticdocuments.com. And that's where you can go and see most of the MJ-12 related documents there. And they went to the National Archives as well and pulled a lot of information, but there's no official direct information in the government about MJ-12. Okay. I mean, you can look at the biographies of the alleged members and all that, but I mean, any number of people could have been qualified to serve on that committee. So just because those 12 people are mentioned doesn't mean that they were really the people, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the committee actually existed. It doesn't even mean that it was called MJ-12. It may have been called something else, or the committee there may have been an MJ-12 committee and it served a completely different purpose than UFOs. And the reason why I'm saying that is because we have no official confirmation of it. And after the documents came out, that it did create a little bit of a splash in the major media. In fact, there was an interview on the Nightline program in the 1980s, which is a very popular news program run by Ted Koppel on ABC. And the FBI undertook an investigation themselves because no one else had at least in official circles, had heard of this MJ12. So they started looking into it to see if they could find anyone that knew anything about it, or if they could find any documents on it, and nothing really turned up. And there was a lot of suspicion that Richard Doty had something to do with the creation of the MJ12 papers, and Doty claims that he actually passed 2 polygraph tests, attesting that he had nothing to do with it. So the origin of the MJ12 documents is a mystery, and the reason why I'm so intrigued with it is I want to know who created them and why.
Mhm, mhm. When I looked into it to prepare this program, I had no problem with anonymous delivery of documents, because it's a thing that happens in journalism. You can have data drops from nowhere because the source wants to protect its anonymity completely. But you have to find secondary source to corroborate the documents you have. You can't just build something of something that falls on your lap. You are being manipulated when it happens. And what really interested me in your work is that you are searching this secondary source. I mean, if it's real, there is a paper trail somewhere, even completely redacted, it exists. And as far as I understood, you never find a secondary source for these documents.
Right. And I did, when I was able to retire back in 1989, I moved to Washington, D.C. so that I could go directly to the National Archives and the Library of Congress and do direct research there.
Mhm.
And the first thing I did was I went to the National Archives and I pulled the so-called Cutler-Twining memo. Now, the Cutler-Twining memo was discovered by Bill Moore and Jamie Chandray. And what it is it's a memorandum from Robert Cutler, who was an aide to President Eisenhower. It was a memorandum from him to General Nathan Twining, an alleged MJ12 member. And the memorandum simply states that the plan of the meeting, the MJ12 Special Studies Project meeting, had been changed somewhat for that day, and Twining was being advised of that.
Mhm.
And this memorandum, this document, which is actually in the National Archives because it was discovered there, and because it was discovered there, then it's property of the archives. Okay,
Mhm.
and that paper had undergone a great deal of scrutiny as well, and it's suspicious for a number of reasons. What happened was Bill Moore and Jamie Chandray ordered this whole set of boxes. I believe it was record group 341, and there were Air Force records from that time period. And when they went through the boxes, they discovered this paper, this Cutler-Twining memorandum. Now, I've been to the National Archives, and I've ordered documents that they're called pulls. You pull documents, from the archives,
Mhm.
and they, depending on how many you order, they come in boxes. If there are a number of boxes involved, they have them on a cart, and it's pushed out. You push it out on a cart to your desk, and you have these file boxes. They open up over the top, and inside are file folders. So the documents themselves, the legitimate documents are all in file folders. Well, when Moore and Chandray went through a certain box, they found this Cutler-Twining memorandum, but it was between 2 file folders.
Mhm.
Okay, that's not normal.
Mhm.
And so when that was discovered, the supervising archivist at the time undertook an investigation. The National Archives undertook an investigation, and they couldn't find any government agency that knew anything about it. And the information in the memorandum didn't stack up with what was known about President Eisenhower's schedule.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was there in Washington, I wrote a letter to the person who was named as the archivist, and actually had lunch with this person, and had a pretty
Nice.
lengthy conversation. With my question was, how did this document get into where it was? Now,
exactly.
Now being a little bit of a conspiratorial UFO type guy like me, I'm wondering, did guys in suits with earplugs, crew cuts, earplugs, come into the back room and tell everyone to leave, and they stuck that document in there? But the archivist was absolutely adamant that that couldn't have happened, because the archivists themselves have the authority to examine documents and declassify them if warranted. Okay, they're cleared to do that, and so I think in talking with this person, I came to the conclusion that somebody probably went into the archives as a researcher. They had that document on hand, and they inserted they pulled the document box from a researcher standpoint, and then inserted the document into that box. And we also want to remember that this occurred during the 1980s. And even though they had security and they had rules back then, they weren't as strict. They weren't quite as diligent as they are now. If you go into the National Archives in the United States now, things are pretty secure. Things are pretty secure. They have some very strict rules, and it's very difficult to bring documents out or to bring documents in or to take them out without authorization.
The question that popped in my mind when I read that event was, is there a logbook of people that could have requested that box file? Because in the French military archives, everything is logged. Everything you consult is logged inside the book, and you can trace back which files are consulted by different researchers. Do you have the same thing in the US National Archives?
Yes, and I made that request through the Freedom of Information Act. The problem is the records have been destroyed because it was so long ago. They don't keep certain things. They don't keep forever.
Yeah, we have the same problem. And it's not malevolent. It's just for sparing of space. They just destroy boxes and crates that haven't been consulted for decades. It's really sad. It's really sad.
Yeah, certain logs or things. I mean, we're talking about something that was 35 years ago.
Yeah,
that's a pretty long time. So I'm not really thinking that it's a conspiracy, to conceal the truth. But I did make an attempt through the Freedom of Information Act to see if I could find out what records were pulled when.
Exactly. But I think it's really important to have it cleared up. So the question that arises is that it could be an half truth. We are now in the intelligence world. You can spread information by creating a lie sandwich. So you create a lie at the beginning, a truth in the middle, and a lie at the end, and you spread that information inside a society that is disregarded by most people because there is lies at the beginning and at the end, but the information true inside spreads. So if we use this idea on the MG12s, what is the idea inside the MG12? That there is some people that have been selected to deal with the problem inside some kind of governmental umbrella. And from the research I made, I think it's true. I have made in contacts that have been in touch with such a structure and at an international level. So when I read that, it really reminded me of Jaime Shed, I think it was a year ago, a national hero of Israeli intelligence and space program, and that just in an interview out of the blue spreads a lot of information that really resembles a lie sandwich with insane ideas at the beginning, insane ideas at the end, but in the middle, you have an information that could be true. Do you have this analysis about these documents?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a possibility. The original documents, the three that I'm talking about, have been pretty much to be shown that they're not authentic. In other words, they're fabrications. But just because they're fabrications does not necessarily mean that there's no correct information in there.
Mhm.
For example, I could create a fabricated letter about you, Baptiste, but it could contain correct information in it. Okay. And the fact that I forged a letter by you does not mean that you don't exist.
Mhm.
Okay. So, but there are some of the more conservative UFO types out there, and they're very good investigators generally, but they jump to the conclusion that because the document's not authentic, then MJ12 doesn't exist or it never existed. Now, I hold out the possibility that MJ12 or something like it could have existed, but I really only think that could have been the case if one or more UFOs had been recovered, or if somehow maybe the government got into direct contact and communication with one or more of these alien groups. And I think that those one or more of those conditions would have to be present before you would have something like MJ12.
Mhm.
But just
Um,
because the documents are fabrication, in my mind, doesn't necessarily mean that MJ12 never existed.
mhm. And I found very interesting that in the last month, a lot of senior intelligence US officials came forward about UFO saying, no, it's true, it's real. And the reaction from the commentators, commenters, I don't know the word, those who comment inside the UFO community was despiteful. It was very aggressive towards these intelligence officials, fearing manipulation and some kind of uh, s- infiltration by the intelligence service. Uh, in your point of view, you dug into this side of the topic for years now. How do you consider these intelligence officials coming forward?
I think they're telling the truth. Now, the two most prominent people in this whole current sequence of events since 2017 have been Louis Elizondo and Christopher Mellon. And I believe that they're sincere, that they're trying to do what they can to induce or even force the Pentagon to disclose more information about what they know about UFOs and to undertake legitimate investigations of what appear to be very, very important events. These Tic Tacs and these UFOs flying over naval operations and naval exercises and things like that.
Mhm.
I don't think that Elizondo and Mellon are undertaking some kind of disinformation or deception campaign to manipulate the public. Now, on the Pentagon side, the Air Force has had a policy since the early 50s of downplaying UFOs and keeping absolutely silent as they can be about the whole UFO issue publicly.
Mhm.
Okay, and this had its formal initiation from the Robertson panel in 1952,
Mhm.
and the Air Force followed this policy that they would downplay any public UFO sightings that were getting attention, and then they went just almost absolutely completely silent about it after 1969 when they closed Project Blue Book and the Condon Committee published their report from the University of Colorado. So what's going on now is the Air Force, you'll note that the Air Force is saying absolutely nothing about this right now.
Yes.
And I wrote a little research paper about psychological warfare and strategic deception, but I think the name of the game with the Air Force, at least, is information management. And that information management is shut up and don't talk about it. Now, and I did reference the author of a paper that I used the information in there to create this timeline of propaganda and psychological warfare. And the paper had been written by Susan Goff, who is the information person there at the Pentagon. Now, why does the Air Force want to be silent about UFOs? And I think the name of the game there is they don't want congressional investigations. They don't want to have to be dragged in front of a congressional committee and explain what they don't want to explain. And then there are two sides to that. The Air Force does not want to be involved in UFOs publicly, but I believe, and Richard Doty is to be believed, and I think it's probably true, that the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, the AFOSI, they do investigate UFOs that have anything to do with Air Force operations. You know, if a UFO is sighted over an Air Force base or it affects government equipment or property or anything like that. So there's a public side to it, and then there's a not so public side to it.
I'm not disculping the Air Force, but from the outside, there is an interesting symmetry between the Air Force refusing to talk about UFOs and the Navy refusing to talk about underwater objects. So I'm also wondering if it's not a kind of rivalry, because we know that Luis Elizondo has strong ties with naval intelligence, and there is a rivalry between the Navy and the Air Force. And I often wonder at which level it's not just personal misbehavior compared to institutional or state malevolence.
It's what I call, I created a little phrase that I call domestic opposition.
Yes.
And that's where you have agencies, you know, in conflict with each other. And this inter-service rivalry has been going on at least since World War II, if not earlier, and it was really a severe problem. And that's one reason why they created the Department of Defense, and they created the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so that the services, the military services, would work together. And the military services each have their own investigative arms. You know, the Air Force has the AFOSI, which we've mentioned, and the Navy has its Criminal Investigative Service. So they don't necessarily share information. And that's one of the things that I think Luis Elizondo and Chris Mellon are trying to achieve, is that after 9/11, the United States government formed this, you know, the Department of Homeland Security, and they tried to consolidate all this intelligence information in the Director of National Intelligence. So part of the strategy here from Elizondo and Mellon is to have the Congress request and or dictate to the Pentagon that these services, you know, that they share their information that they're collecting about these UFO incidents, and have it collated and analyzed and then synthesized into reports ultimately under the direction of the Director of National Intelligence. And then that should go, you know, theoretically to the president and to the Congress and ultimately to the American public. But I have a little joke, Baptiste, that if we ever get disclosure, with the big D, it's going to be redacted.
I think it's clear. I think it's clear. There is one part I would like to dig further regarding the Condon report. It's something that just floored me when I heard about it, and it wasn't so long ago. Just two quotes. Even before its completion, the Air Force had asked the National Academy of Sciences to provide an independent assessment of the scope, the methodology, and the findings of the committee. A panel chaired by Yale astronomer Gerald M. Clements studied the report for 6 weeks and concluded that on the basis of present knowledge, the least likely explanation of UFOs is the hypothesis of extraterrestrial visitation by intelligent beings, and that no high priority in UFO investigations is warranted by data of the past 2 decades. And the second quote, the National Academy of Science is a private, non-profit organization of the country's leading researchers. The NAS recognizes and promotes outstanding science through elections to membership publication of its journal, PNAS, and its awards programs and special activities. Through the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, the NAS provides objective, science-based advice on critical issues affecting the nation. We had pretty much our own Project Blue Book in France in 1977. And if something like that would have happened, the NAS would have been burned to the ground. I mean, I see manipulation there. For academics to validate a report from a committee that has been that far off data from the Blue Book file, there is manipulation there. And I understand the anger of people when something like that happened. But strangely enough, it is even poorly known by US researchers. The fact that their NAS validated the Condon report is just not known. And I think it's the best proof that there is a manipulation.
I think the whole process there had been set up in advance. Maybe not on a dictatorial level, but there was kind of a wink and a nod that things were going to turn out a certain way. And there were some things that were going on. The Air Force was wanting to get publicly out of the UFO business, and they were looking for a way to do that. They went shopping for a group that would conduct this study. Dr. Condon at the University of Colorado agreed to undertake it, and he was one of the top scientists in the United States. So I've read the Condon report. It's very, very well written, and there is a lot of interesting information in there, and it's also extremely educational on how to study UFO issues. But the conclusions in the report were written by Dr. Condon, and I think it was pretty much decided in advance what the conclusions were going to be. And with a wink and a nod, and the Old Boy Network and the National Science Foundation or whoever, they were going to approve it. They were going to approve that report. They weren't going to kick it back to Condon and say, you don't know what you're talking about, start all over. Because the Condon Project, I'm calling it the Condon Project, but the University of Colorado, it had a budget, it had a certain amount of money and a certain amount of time that they could spend on it. I think there were probably a lot more cases that they could have gone into in more depth, or other cases that they never even looked at. And there are reasons for that, but I think overall, the outcome was basically predetermined. And it's consistent with the information policies that the Air Force had undertaken since the Robertson panel in 1952.
There is it's a bit off topic, but I think you will understand the link with what we're talking about. There is something that is puzzling me is that, and I don't know if it's cultural. That's my question, because I'm French and you're American, so maybe you can explain it to me. But there is a weird belief structure I identify inside most people interested by this topic, is that they want to believe in something. And I really don't understand why. Why put belief in something? Like you just have to read studies, uh, counter examine them, search through data. Why put belief each time? Because you hear that in all debates or public questions that are asked to guests like you. There is always that what do you think and what do you know? And I found that very puzzling to me. It's something we would never ask. What do you believe? It wouldn't be allowed in France.
Right. And the problem with the UFO issue is you don't know when you're going to see a UFO and you don't know where. So it's not like you can take a lawn chair and a pair of binoculars and a notebook and just sit and wait for the UFOs to show up and then do all kinds of scientific work. And
Mhm.
a lot of science is based on duplication. You conduct an experiment, and then other scientists conduct the same experiment and see if they get the same results. That's almost impossible to do with UFOs. Now, what we do have with UFOs, at least from my opinion, is we have what in the US is called a preponderance of evidence.
Mhm.
So, like in criminal law, uh, in serious crimes, you have to be jury has to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that you're guilty. But in civil law, if you're undertaking some kind of a lawsuit, you can win if you have the proper preponderance of evidence in your favor. And I think that's what we have in the UFO field.
Mhm.
But what we don't have is solid official confirmation because, like it or not, whether we like our respective governments or not in general, the United States government has a tremendous amount of credibility still.
Mhm.
And if what they say about an issue like UFOs, whether it's from the director of national intelligence or whether it's from the Air Force or the Pentagon or the White House or even the national press like the New York Times, whatever they say, that carries a tremendous amount of weight. And if they give the impression that the UFO issue is real, then I think eventually people will start to, they'll start to get into line with that.
Mm. No, I agree. I'm a teacher. I use this channel to provide information to my students and information management, as you referred to it previously. And it's very interesting to track down how information spreads from the US into Europe. And i- the moment the DoD publishes statements, in 15 minutes it arrives in Europe. But when the 2017 papers by Blumenthal, Keane, and Cooper were published, it took a week to arrive in Europe. It was very interesting. The US government has channels in medias everywhere. So when they state something, it becomes a truth, and it's almost unheard of. It's like a consensual, fabricated truth. It doesn't mean it's not right, but it is fabricated. It is voluntarily fabricated, and we saw that last June, like at the beginning at the beginning of the month of June, before the UAPTF report was disclosed, there were some leaks inside the New York Times that explained it's not alien. Like 20 days before the report was published, and then the report is published, and it was very obvious at the time. It's a trade-off from the DoD. Okay, we give you some information about the content, but you really title it's not aliens in the beginning. And they have to withdraw the title afterwards because it wasn't written inside the article. So, on an academic level, completely disconnected from what are UFOs, what are the implications of UFOs. It's really interesting to see how information is engineered inside the halls of power, if we can use that term. And I think that the work you're doing by digging through these papers is the only kryptonite the American can use against that kind of engineering, because it always leaves a paper trail somewhere, but you need to have that memory of the paper trail and that historically knowledge of documents to be able to understand what is happening today in information management.
Yeah, you made a number of very, very good points there, Baptiste, because as you know, the United States economy and business is based on a capitalistic system, and the media, the so-called national media, the newspapers and TV networks, and all of these, they're private companies. They're owned by ultimately owned by their stockholders. But in essence, the national media, like I just mentioned, in essence, they're state media.
Hmm.
The reporters and the editors of these media outlets, they have relations with people in government. That's how they get their information. So they're not going to, generally speaking, buck the government people and make them look bad, because they have to have a relationship with them to get the information they need to publish their stories. Now, if a national issue comes up, or anything, especially affecting so-called national security, the government people, Pentagon, the White House, State Department, whomever, they'll go to the national media here and they'll ask them to cooperate with their information management, because from the government standpoint, these are national security issues. Okay, so from that side, we definitely have a state media arrangement, as far as I'm concerned, from my point of view. On the other side of it, as citizens, it's more and more difficult to sort through things and really decide for ourselves what is true and what is not true. For one thing, we're overwhelmed with information. Not only do you have
Mhm.
TV and some newspapers, but you have the internet and all of this. So we're deluged with information, and I think that as citizens, at least from the American side, and I'm sure from the French side, on the European side, we have to be careful about how we process the information that we're getting. And it's very easy to get impressions about things just from seeing things superficially on the internet or on television. And a lot of people don't have the time or the interest to really sift through all of this and try to separate truth from falsehood, and useful information from the trash. And thank you for mentioning that, but that is what I'm trying to do here.
Mhm. And it's something that is still true today. With the Ukrainian conflict, the US told us for almost years that the Russia was going strong on its conquest of territories. And to be honest, we have been very doubtful here in Europe, because the US DoD bullshitted us to no end before, with Iraq, with Afghanistan, with the Saudis. So we were very doubtful, because you cry wolf, that's all. And for that reason, our eastern flank was absolutely a field day for the Russian army if they wanted to invade. And as there was no structure of power at the time on the military point to face off a possible Russian attack, they felt free of invading Ukraine. And for that reason, for underestimating the strength of Russia and its willingness to attack, the boss of French military intelligence just resigned. So there is a real problem when you engineer truth, is that we just don't believe it when it's true. And it became a real problem. If we had a NATO strong flank, I don't think Russia would have attacked at that point with just a few 100 kilometers of distance between each front. So it's something that is still very true today, in my opinion. To conclude this talk, I would like to call to your financial analysis skills, because in France we know that money is the blood of war, and it's true in research fields. If you give money to scientists, they do science. That's all. What I identified when I first looked into that subject a year ago, it was the complete lack of grants and funds for specific research in UFOs. And I said to myself that you're asking scientists to work for free on something that is endangering their career and reputation, while their career and reputation is the only thing they all dare, to be honest. Most people don't understand the specialty of a scientist, except the 3 or 4 colleagues in his very specific field. So his reputation as scientist and his diplomas are all he has. And to listen to an UFO community that completely lacks basic understanding of science and epistemology, request scientific inquiry without funds, grants, or protection of reputation. Really, I found that quite scandalous. And my question to you is, what could be a reliable financial structure that could finance scientific research inside laboratories and observatories in UFOs? We have the example of Project Galileo, but it's private funds that are donated, so I don't consider it reliable on the long term. Sorry, there's quite a lot of impact to unpack.
Well, there's this state of affairs, this set of conditions in the academic community that it's not career enhancing to be involved in so-called fringe subjects.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, and like I mentioned earlier, Baptiste, there has to be some kind of confirmation from authority being the government or the national media or establishment science, some respected level of authority that says UFOs are okay. Okay, it's serious. They should be studied. And that hasn't ever really happened.
Yes.
And once that does happen, I think some money will flow, maybe some money from the government. There are a lot of billionaires out there that can fund plenty of research if they want to. There are foundations like the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundations and all of that. There's plenty of money to fund research. The problem is social. It's a social problem. There's a perception that serious scientists and serious academics shouldn't be involved in fringe subjects. Let's hope that that's changing a little bit now, and let's hope that it keeps changing.
From what I've heard from my friends in the US, we only see the ripples in the sea. There is a lot of projects that are undergoing structuration and financial structuration at the time to then propel scientific research. So I think we will see better days. Not too far from now, we will see better days on the scientific research on this field. And I can't overstate enough how the implication of scientists is vital to that field. and how at one point or another, the weakest information will disappear because they will be replaced by consensual or scientifically true information. Tom, thank you so much for that talk. It was really interesting, and it has been a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Baptiste. It's been an honor to be with you. I've enjoyed it very, very much. And good luck with your future efforts.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank
Goodbye,
you.
everyone. We will see you at the next episode.